Okay, well, thanks all for coming out on a rainy day. I'm delighted to see you all. This is the first in a series, a speaker series, that the Cross-Border Institute will be doing. I'm Bill Anderson. I'm the director of the Cross-Border Institute, which, if you don't know us, we are the only institute in Canada that's specifically focused on the movement of goods, people, and services across the Canada-US border. And this is our first occasion for the speaker series, which is generously being supported by the University of Windsor. And I want to particularly thank the Vice President Michael Sue for the support that he's giving to this program. And we have the ideal person to kick it off. We have the person that I always can't have a series at the Canada-US border if Chris Sands isn't there. So let me give a little introduction to Chris. Chris Sands is the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And he's concurrently the G. Robert Ross Distinguished Visiting Professor of Canada, U.S. Business and Economic Relations in the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University. And you know, it's tough to do two jobs, but they're both in Washington, right? So, yeah, they're on the opposite Washington. In fact, we have sort of opportunistically grabbed Chris as he's driving from one to the other, and so that was one of the reasons that we chose this particular day. He's worked for more than 22 years in DC think tanks, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Hudson Institute. He was, from 2002 to 2007, the Director of Strategic Planning and Program Evaluation in the International Republican Institute. He did his doctoral dissertation on the North American automotive industry, the political economy of the North American automotive trade regime, specifically. And he serves on the executive board of the Canadian Politics section of the American Political Science Association. In 2009, he wrote a report on the border called Towards a New Frontier, Improving the Canada-US Border. And I think many of us have read it. There was a time when there was a bunch of reports that came out on the border. This was certainly the best known and the best of those reports. And after all of those years, since 2009, Chris decided it was time to take another look, and specifically to look at how the progress on the Canada-US border went along during the Barack Obama administration. And he's going to be publishing a report through another famous Washington think tank, the Woodrow Wilson Center, on that very topic. But we're going to be the first ones to hear about it today, or one of the first, because Chris is going to give us a little preview of what he has to say in that report. And so I am going to turn it over to Chris, and then we'll have a question and answer afterwards. So, Chris Sands.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It is great to be back in Windsor, a town that I'm very fond of, actually. And as my dad, who's here, will attest, when I was growing up, the Windsor kids came over to Michigan to drink because our drinking age was only 18. So that's how far back I go with this particular border. I want to talk a little bit about where we are now, and I have to give Bill credit because lately nobody can get through teeing up me talking about what's happening and what's changing in one Washington or the other without mentioning our new president south of the border, or north of this border, Donald Trump. And in some ways, the report I'm writing now about what's happened in on the border during the Obama years is meant for his administration. The first report I wrote, Brookings had asked me to get involved and to write this study because after 8 years of George W. Bush, a lot had changed. 9/11, but then all of the changes after. And President Obama picked Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano to be his Secretary of Homeland Security. And the immediate thought was, here is a obviously very bright and talented person whose familiarity is primarily with the southern border and not the northern border. So can we make the case that the northern border is different, special, et cetera? In fact, one of the first things that she did in office was say to her staff, why should we treat the northern border differently? What about it that is different? And helpfully, I had a report right there, and she was able to take it up. And the report did fairly well. The impetus for the second report really is that now we have a new president, and he's picked General John Kelly, who served as the head of U.S. Southern Command, and so also knows the southern border better than the northern border. And hopefully we can come up with some good ideas for how to make the border better. And although any time you start talking about Donald Trump, sort of like talking about Voldemort, there's a shiver that runs through the audience. Nothing good can come of this, I know. But I have to say I'm somewhat optimistic. I think that this is the first time since 9/11, or maybe the best time since 9/11, to have a conversation about facilitation again. Those of you who follow the border, this was always the argument that sort of after 9/11, we had to secure the border because of terrorism, and the Americans, as you know, we tend to be focused on security, so security was paramount. We tried talking about facilitation back then. Jean Chrétien's government raised options to facilitate, but they tended to go very badly in Washington because they said, well, this is lowering security. Can't do that. We have to focus, number one, on the security agenda. And when the Obama administration started, there were some of us who were hoping that maybe this would change, that there would be a bit more focus on facilitation. But the Obama administration turned out to be also somewhat worried about appearing to lower security because terrorism was still a concern, and they didn't want to be the presidency that came after George W. Bush where we had another big attack. So while they worked on the margins, the rhetoric was all very much about security still. But Donald Trump doesn't seem to have a predisposition on the border per se, but he does focus on business and the hassles and the red tape that business faces, which he thinks is strangling the economy and hurting the U.S. growth rate. And his agenda, focusing on, for example, freezing regulations, then eliminating 2 regulations for every 1 new one that you want to bring in, is very much the kind of, it's a bit simplistic, but it's sort of the businessman's idea of cutting red tape. And I think our border, even though the regulations of the border are there for a good reason, also has a bit of a red tape problem. The compliance cost is very high. It's not about the standard, it's about what you have to do to meet the standard, to provide the information, to move your goods and services back and forth across the border. I think now we have an opportunity to talk about simplifying the border processes so that we can cross almost like we used to. I'll come back to that in a minute. Goods, especially here in the heart of the automotive corridor, have done relatively better moving back and forth across the border because the big companies made sure that programs like CTPAT and FAST were designed to work with industrial supply chains. There's more participation in FAST and CTPAT here in this corridor than there is out west, where I also teach the other Washington, where you have so much more of the traffic being tourism, being individuals. It's stronger here than it is in the Northeast, where the manufacturing linkages aren't quite that strong. But the program still only has, and Bill will probably know the current number, still only has about 45% participation in terms of the actual volume of traffic that's in the program that crosses the border here. So there's a lot that we're leaving out. Some of that is small packages, small goods, because we have a lot of businesses that can ship with FedEx or UPS. Those goods go to the border, and thanks to UPS and FedEx, we're able to get some of those through because it's a hard shipment to clear. It's a whole bunch of boxes from a whole bunch of different people, and it has a whole variety of contents. And we've created a system in which we can move some of those goods back and forth by truck and a lot of times by plane. But that's taken a long time to set up, and it's still not as smooth as it could be, in part because of the worry about collecting customs duties on some of these goods. And if you're an online shopper here and you've tried to buy things from some of the US vendors, you know that you'll get a nice note with your package that says you owe Canada Customs a certain amount of money for your shipment moving back and forth across the border, which can actually make it less appealing to buy things from an American website, which is good for Amazon Canada, but maybe not good for the average consumer. The other problem we have, and we had it on our drive over here, is the differential treatment of tourism versus business travelers. And this is another issue which I think the Trump administration will find appealing to work on. Canada doesn't, if you come up for tourism, you're allowed to enter Canada for up to 3 months without a visa for tourist purposes. You can do the same going into the US. All you have to have is your passport, and you come down for tourism, coming down to visit grandkids, all of that is allowed. However, if you're a business traveler and you come into Canada, then the question is, well, who's paying you? And are you going to be here very long? Do you have any letters that prove that you're not overstaying? And what's your company? And do you have a business card? because Canada's labor market regulations have been designed to protect Canadian jobs by making sure that people aren't coming in and stealing that work. But it's a very old-fashioned system. I think there's an opportunity now to start treating business travelers the same way we treat tourists, allowing them to be able to move back and forth across the border for up to 3 months without having to have a visa, without having to have a hassle. They just have to say, we're coming up for business. Whether they're investing, whether they're looking to go to a business conference, or just coming up to think about doing something new here, having a board meeting. Donald Trump himself, we know, has had a bit of a problem coming up to Canada when he was working, I guess he only puts his name on it, on the big Trump Hotel in Toronto, which is conveniently right near the Hudson Bay store downtown, and not a bad place to go, near the old City Hall. I can't afford Trump Tower prices, so I neither stay there nor eat there, but it's not political, it's just I'm broke. But he, going back and forth trying to negotiate the deal over the rights to that particular hotel, he also got stopped at the border, and they wanted to know, well, what are you doing here, and so on and so forth. So we know he has that memory of the border at least. He's still got a big hotel condo project in Vancouver. We haven't figured out if that's a violation of the emoluments clause in the Constitution, but anyway, it's full of Chinese business people anyway, and Malaysians. Malaysians are building it for him, actually, so that's very nice. But the ability to stop bothering our business people, making it simpler to go back and forth for business, could have a potential benefit and is consistent with the Trump agenda. The biggest thing, however, that I think is coming with regard to the border and has the potential under Donald Trump to cause trouble is the renegotiation of NAFTA. And I think renegotiating NAFTA has huge implications for a couple of reasons. First, we've been used to these rules for 20 years. They're not all perfect, for sure, but we know what they're like. And NAFTA rules, changing them, will be different than negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the CETA agreement between Canada and the European Union, because we're already living in those rules. If you negotiate a new trade agreement, obviously everyone wonders what's that going to mean for our economy, and then the agreement comes in and you adapt to it and you try to find a way to do, continue doing what you're doing or take advantage of its benefits. With NAFTA renegotiation, while we're already living in NAFTA, it's like making repairs or upgrades to your car while you're driving it. It's a highly dangerous enterprise because people's jobs, their investments, the structure of value chains and supply chains has been set to take advantage of a current set of rules. Even raising the question of whether those rules will be around in 5 years has the ability to chill investment and have people sit on their money and not want to create a job or do whatever they would normally do. We saw a bit of this during the Obama years in the United States when many of the big policy initiatives the Obama administration undertook raised questions about big parts of the economy. The one that you'll be familiar with is our healthcare reform. By raising a question mark over what your healthcare costs are going to be as an employer for your employees, what they'll be for you as an individual if you have to buy them from the Obamacare marketplaces, and what that's going to mean for adding one more employee to your current workforce. Those questions not only remained for a number of years as the regulations that implemented healthcare reform came out, but they then continued because of all the lawsuits to try to take the legislation out in the courts. So that over the course of 8 years, we never quite settled these questions. We're still debating them, as you know now. And we had a period of 1.8% growth, never cracked 2% in 8 years. And it's one of the reasons that I think Donald Trump got elected, because of this feeling that the economy was down and we weren't making America great again. And so we need to revive the economy with a pro-growth strategy. I mention it not to take a shot at healthcare reform, but to say that this is the kind of effect you get when you take something so important to so many jobs and you put a big question mark over it. Even if at the end of the negotiation we come out with more or less NAFTA as we knew it, certainly for autos, maybe for some other sectors, that uncertainty is going to be bad for our economy, and it's ultimately bad for the U.S. plans to get back on a growth track. So the sooner we settle it, the better. So what can we expect from NAFTA renegotiation? I'll talk a little bit about the process and then about maybe the outcomes. The process has been laid out for us to some extent by Wilbur Ross in an interview, who's the new Secretary of Commerce, in an interview with Bloomberg. He said that it was likely that we would begin negotiations at the end of this year, probably closer to November or December now, and the negotiations would take about a year, and then we would go to ratification. Now, I think it's optimistic because a negotiation that starts in November and lasts a year will have two important speed bumps. One is the Mexican election in the summer of 2018, which is both presidential and congressional as well, so it'll be a big upheaval there. And the second one is American midterm congressional elections in 2018 in November. A lot of members will not want to go to those elections with a controversial NAFTA renegotiation in front of them. Some of them may be able to do it if the negotiations are ongoing and there's nothing conclusive, but it's likely to become an election issue. They also probably don't want to go back if we haven't started renegotiating NAFTA either, because it'll look like a promise that hasn't been met. Reflecting that, one of the things that we've started to see coming out of the Trump administration is signals that they are looking to have a new grant of trade promotion authority for the NAFTA renegotiation. Now, this wasn't something we anticipated. Going in to the Trump administration, we do have trade promotion authority for the U.S. administration that was earned by President Obama in 2013, and it lasts until 2018 calendar year, so you can make it, you could stretch it. So we already have this authority. We thought, well, we'll just use that authority to renegotiate NAFTA now. There are a couple of problems. One is the timing. If the authority expires before you've brought the agreement back to Congress, you need a new grant of authority or an extension. Might be able to get that, but the second problem is you asked for that negotiating authority for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with Europe, which is our attempt to follow your lead with the CETA. But you didn't do that for NAFTA renegotiation. So given that you're changing the topic, I think the conclusion has been in the Trump White House that they're going to have to come back and get a clean trade promotion authority grant, a fast track grant, if you will, to be able to negotiate entirely on their own. To do that, we've seen them revive something that used to be common. We remember it from when NAFTA was being negotiated or Canada's free trade. The president and his senior officials have been going out around the country talking about the things that matter to individual congressmen. In order to tell them, your issue is my issue and it's on the agenda. That's why you saw the president go to Wisconsin and talk about dairy. He went to New York and talked about dairy, something that in some ways wasn't a surprise because it was on the TPP agenda as well, and Canada had been prepared to make concessions in TPP, so we knew it was probably going to come up under NAFTA. But I think a lot of Canadians were quite surprised that suddenly there was this week where not only that came up, but softwood lumber as well. It seemed like we were hitting all of the Canadian vulnerabilities when President Trump had said he was only going to tweak the agreement with regard to the United States, or Canada-U.S. relationship. Well, that's interesting, but I think it's also very typical of where we are. The need to get individual congressmen, Democrats and Republicans, and senators, to agree to give him authority. He needs to tell them, your issues are on my agenda. And when he reassures them of that and they give him the authority, they may or may not be in the final agreement. They'll certainly be on the agenda. It doesn't mean we should panic. I think we should take that as a reasonably good sign that the trade negotiation process in the U.S., which is usually ugly and in your face, is working as it's supposed to. But softwood lumber did surprise a lot of people, particularly out in British Columbia, also in Quebec, partly because it had never been part of NAFTA. Some of you will remember we negotiated our first big softwood lumber agreement in 1986 because we felt we needed to clear the decks before we talked about Canada's free trade. This issue was so thorny, we wanted a deal settled, and then we could talk about the rest of the relationship. And we've had agreements almost every decade since in that vein. That didn't mean the softwood couldn't use NAFTA dispute resolution. It was always able to use the benefits of NAFTA, but we hadn't really talked about it in that context. This is another sign from the Trump administration, I think, that they believe this issue, which is a perennial, will be easier to resolve in a broader context where you can trade off maybe concessions on softwood versus concessions on dairy or something else. By broadening the list of issues on the table, softwood might be easier because someone's not going to like the outcome, but maybe they can be assuaged with a concession in another area. Will it work? I don't no. Mulrooney didn't think it would, but now we have a different team, and so it's possible that this will help us to put softwood lumber away as an issue for a long time. And it sounds unlikely, but for those of you who followed Canada-US trade, we used to think we'd never get done talking about fish, and we've largely moved off fish now. So it's possible, and I think that's also a good sign. It's also interesting to me when you look at a couple of the documents the Trump administration has put out that tell us something about NAFTA, how consistent he's been about following the rules. Some of you will see in early 2017, January, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office issued a 2017 trade strategy, which is required by statute. Congress wants a strategy to know what you think the issues are, what are your top priorities in trade negotiation. And the trade strategy was full of all the issues we already knew had been on the Canada-US negotiating agenda, things like pharmaceutical intellectual property, approvals of, there was super calendar paper in addition to softwood lumber. There was a concern about gypsum, which has interestingly become a recent concern, counterfeit goods and Canadian customs inspection of those goods before they come to the U.S. So all of those issues were there, but also so was a careful fidelity to the requirements of Super 301, if they were to use that, the limits and the benefits of NAFTA Chapter 19 and NAFTA Chapter 20, dispute settlement, all very careful. Then we saw the leaked NAFTA letter from the acting U.S. Trade Representative. We still don't have our Trade Representative confirmed. And this too was very consistent with past statements about our trade disputes. It didn't surprise anybody. And that suggests to me that we have the disputes that industry is concerned about. We do not have a very original agenda from Donald Trump to go after Canada. I'll give you another bit of maybe reassurance, and that comes from the auto sector, which is so important here. And if you watched Donald Trump, he has that bad habit of tweeting. Some of us do it. We try to keep it private. He does not. His tweets after the election and before his inauguration included tweets in which he was very critical of Ford, GM, and even Toyota, which is not an American headquartered firm, for expanding their investments in Mexico. Everyone he had a nasty comment about, talking about it being un-American and not good for the economy and his disappointment. Shortly thereafter, we saw Ford with a big investment here. We saw Honda expand at Alliston, and there was nothing. The silence of the tweets, if you will. And suddenly that told me that for Trump, and certainly I think for a lot of his voters, Canada is not on the hit list, especially not in automotive. The perception is that Canada pays fair wages, is a fair trader in these areas. It doesn't mean we're not going to have disputes, but it was a broad reassurance that there wasn't a Canadian animus behind some of the NAFTA renegotiation, consistent with his comment that we would tweak the agreement with regard to Canada, but not necessarily do major overhaul. The last thing that I think is an indication of where we're headed came from the confirmation hearings for Robert Lighthizer, who is the nominee to be U.S. Trade Representative. Interestingly, he had a background as a trade litigator. Some of you will remember he was Deputy U.S. Trade Representative briefly during the Reagan administration. He also served as the leading trade advisor for Bob Dole when he ran for president. And if you remember that race, it was 1996. Bob Dole on trade said, we've had a lot of big trade agreements. They just had the Uruguay round as well as the NAFTA agreement. He said, we need to take a pause and see how these agreements really work before we go forward. That's Lighthizer's idea, which is that the value of a trade agreement is in the litigation you get from it and whether you succeed in getting people to stop cheating or doing something negative. Lighthizer's confirmation hearings, people were expecting comments on China, they're expecting comments on Mexico, but most of the comments that came from the Senate and from the House committees that reviewed his nomination were about Canada. And they were the kind of issues that matter in local districts. We talked about dairy, we talked about softwood, we talked about Canadian steel, and all of them sort of brought us back to the same agenda. It's a handful of issues that we've known for a while that I think will animate the NAFTA discussion. Now, based on that anticipation of what we'll see, I think the Canadian trade debate has started off in an overly defensive way. The number of people that I talk to in Ottawa who say, well, we're going to go into the negotiations and our number one goal is to walk out with exactly what we had when we walked in. Just NAFTA the way it is, the predictable, the familiar. And if we have to put a few things in there for Trump, fine, but we want to keep as much as we can. And I think that is like walking over to the Windsor Casino with the idea that you're going to walk out with the exact same amount of money that you walked in with. It's so defensive that you may not actually have any fun. And I'm not suggesting trade negotiation is fun, but there's an opportunity in renegotiating our North American arrangements to do some things that are really net positive. And this is where I'm going to come back to the border. A lot of things we didn't think of as part of the trade agenda when we negotiated NAFTA and Canada's free trade have become attached to trade. Most notably things like the environment, which was really outside the agreement. If it wasn't for Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien, you wouldn't have had a Commission on Environmental Cooperation set up in Montreal as a side agreement to NAFTA. Labor. We didn't, certainly not with Canada's free trade, and later, we didn't really deal with labor very seriously. We have a labor commission that does some studies, not very effectively, but does do some things based, I guess now in Washington or Dallas or someplace. But the Labor Commission was set up as a side agreement, was not part of the mainstream of the agreement. There are a lot of concerns about labor and about labor mobility. We could be talking about labor mobility, certainly skills certification, so that if you're trained in a technical specialty, not just the small list of professions that the NAFTA visas allow for, but let's say you know how to work a programmable machine tool, you're familiar with tool and die, that those kinds of professions could be certified so that your credentials are mutually recognized. Come back to this idea that a business traveler doesn't need a visa for 3 months. You could have people who know how to work in an assembly line or work on equipment here who are going to open up a new line over on the US side, and you could have a Canadian crew come in and do training for 6 weeks, and you wouldn't have to have a visa for those Canadians to go over. Using our brains, as Prime Minister Trudeau likes to say, not just what's under our feet, to be part of the trade picture, and making sure that kind of labor mobility is based on skills and qualification, but open not just to professionals, but to blue-collar workers as well. Things like that might be easier to do Canada-US than Canada-US-Mexico, but if we can set a Canada-US precedent, we'll take it bilaterally. I think that would be positive. We can do it trilaterally and make it skills-based. That's also good. Secondly, I think we have the potential to bring some of the border security measures that we've had imposed on us by fate and by post-September 11 circumstances into the process of our trade negotiation. Security barriers are meant for another purpose, but they do become market access barriers to the extent that they hold people up from being able to move easily back and forth or move their goods easily back and forth. Some of the things that we've negotiated, including some bilateral agreements on small packages and shipments by air, could be folded in so that we have guaranteed rights to be able to move our goods back and forth across the border. Very helpful for small business people, I think. That could include, and I know this is not universally loved, but that could include a mutual and reciprocal raising of de minimis rates, that level below which you don't have to pay customs duty. We're quite at odds now because the U.S. De minimis rate is $800 U.S., so you don't have to pay duty on anything below that value, which means for Americans buying things here or just crossing the border, we can bring an awful lot. And that's, if you're here for a couple of days, you can add to that quite a bit. And a lot of our online shopping can fall under that amount. In Canada, the level is still $20. And so you get hit pretty hard early. And even if you're just buying something on eBay, I know people still collect Beanie Babies. They haven't quite become a surplus, or baseball cards or whatever, where you're not hitting that threshold. We could encourage this and we could incorporate it into our trade agreement to provide that kind of tariff-free treatment below a certain level across the economy. Similarly, I think we have the opportunity to do something really great on energy. This is an issue which, when we negotiated Canada's free trade, we were mostly trying to undo the National Energy Program. And that was the Reagan administration's goal. When we negotiated NAFTA, the Mexicans had a constitutional bar on foreign direct investment or anything to do with foreigners being involved in their energy sector. And so they reserved it in the same way that Canada reserved culture and the US reserved its defense industries from the negotiation. We weren't liberalizing in that area. Now Mexico's made a big change. They've opened up their economy by changing the Constitution and also changing relevant legislation so that we can now see investment in the energy sector. TransCanada obviously very happy now that they have the Keystone Pipeline, has about $8 billion in investment in pipelines and logistics infrastructure in Mexico alone. And that's all been done in the last 3 to 4 years. There is a huge opportunity for Canadian oilfield services, alternative energy producers, and others to begin moving into Mexico, which happily has been growing economically, and if Trump doesn't kneecap them, will continue growing economically, which means their energy demand is rising. That means we have technology that we could sell them and help them to grow in a low carbon impact way, or at least as low as possible. Huge opportunity for growth, especially at a time when gas and oil prices are lower here in North America, in the northern part of North America, and so there aren't as many opportunities in Canada or the US as there will be in Mexico. And so I think energy is an area that we should be talking about, so that the opening of the Mexican energy sector is by treaty rights and not simply by Mexican legislation, which if the Mexican election goes badly, and Donald Trump is certainly annoying the wrong people, so we could end up with a very nationalist Mexican government, some of those benefits could be clawed back. Another area in which NAFTA renegotiation could be a net positive for all of us. One last area, which I think is marrying one of the ideas that Trump talked about in his campaign to the NAFTA agenda, and that is on regulatory cooperation. You may remember that in 2011, Stephen Harper and President Obama launched the Regulatory Cooperation Council, which was designed to pick up where the Security and Prosperity Partnership discussions and economic regulation alignment had left off, which had been designed, of course, to pick up for the NAFTA working groups, which were part of NAFTA, which were designed to align regulation. And for all of the years of all of those groups, we've made very incremental progress in aligning our rules and regulations, primarily in areas where we had an ongoing dialogue and we were able to sort of build on that momentum, but there's a lot of work still to be done. I think it would be difficult to do with Mexico today, but between Canada and the US, I would like to see us have an agreement to provide mutual recognition of the functional equivalency of our regulations across the board. This would produce what trade negotiators call a negative list. That list of things where we simply don't agree that our regulations are functionally equivalent. But if we're talking about the safety of an electrical plug, or child-proof caps, or a toy, or a pencil, there are a number of products where the standards aren't functionally any different. They may be slightly different in the code, but they work exactly the same. Now, why do I suggest this? Because I think first, we could create a lot of winners right away. Most people would see the benefit of this mutual recognition right away, and we'd be only negotiating the tough nuts. So that would mean progress quicker and benefits quicker. Secondly, full mutual recognition would allow us to say for this whole range of products, we don't have to change our own laws. One of the issues that's driving, as you know, Brexit, even the French election now coming up this weekend, is this concern that Brussels was making rules and regulations that were complicating life for businesses, and there was no democratic accountability. You couldn't fire the regulator who came up with some knuckle-headed rule. Here, with full mutual recognition, you can go to your regular member of parliament or provincial parliament, or you can go to a congressman and a senator and say, I hate this rule. Can we fix it? And just through domestic process to fix it. If one side or the other deviates so far from what the other thinks is acceptable, it goes onto the negative list. We start negotiating about it. But by and large, you can always yell at your politicians and say, bring some common sense to your regulatory approach. That keeps our democratic accountability in place, and it doesn't force us to adopt the same rules. We just recognize that the rules are functionally equivalent, so it doesn't mean that we have to have exactly the same rule. Think about the way in which we've approached automotive emissions. Trying to get to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. We had to actually issue the regulations on the same day to the same standard through our separate processes in tandem, which took a fair amount of coordination. Under a mutual recognition agreement, we would simply have rules and regulations for things like that, and whether they were issued at the same time, we'd say, well, it's 55.5 miles per gallon in the US, but Canada has a kilometers per liter standard, and it's just a measurement difference. It doesn't matter. Crash testing for cars, if we could say, well, functionally they're equivalent even if the US uses a 35 mile an hour crash test and Canada uses a 15 kilometer an hour test. So this would allow us to really move forward on economic growth, and it would be consistent with Donald Trump's desire to cut regulations and red tape for small and medium-sized businesses. None of this was really fully part of our last NAFTA negotiation, and what I hear from trade negotiators all the time is, well, when we negotiated NAFTA before, we didn't have the whole internet. And I remember those days. We didn't have email and the internet. Students don't quite believe that we survived, but we did survive without all of that. But what seems more relevant to me is that we didn't have social media either. And I think the NAFTA renegotiation may be the biggest negotiation of the era of social media so far. And the problem with social media is it tends to amplify everything, including the craziest rumors. And I think we're living that now. People see something on Twitter or on Facebook about what Donald Trump has said about dairy, and they're running to the barricades. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. When it's just Donald Trump being Donald Trump, making some ridiculous demand to shock and awe his negotiating partners and bring us all to sort of closer to his middle ground. We're going to have to ride through this NAFTA renegotiation with a bit of calm. As the British say, keep calm and carry on. And that means that social media is going to probably do us more damage than good by getting us to overreact to things and scare our politicians into maybe making concessions or being afraid to dare, and which is what I think has accounted for Canadian defensiveness so far. If we can keep our calm, if we can reach for more than just defensiveness, but actually try to improve our trade negotiating relationship, if we can take the right of crossing back and forth across the border, and we can make it a right, and we can secure greater freedom for people moving, still with security requirements, but at the same time making it easier and simpler, I think we can have a net positive to come out of all of this. For the border, for Windsor and Detroit, and for both countries. There's a lot that could go wrong, but oddly, I'm optimistic. It must be knowing Bill. He always puts a smile on my face. So with that, questions? Or Sure.
Yeah, sit here. That was great, Chris, and you answered all my questions that I have written down here already, but certainly made me think of many more. And so I have a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to let people that are here today ask some questions, and also we may get some questions from people that are watching on Facebook Live. So.
Great.
People are already putting up their hands. But,
for those of you watching on Facebook Live, I know I took a shot at social media and Facebook. I meant it in the best possible way.
I just want to bring up a couple of things before we get onto that. One of the things that you didn't say much about was this Beyond the Border Action Plan, which is something which is sort of the Obama. I mean, I think in a way when that came out, that was an important thing for two reasons. One is that it's, a trade agreement is not a border agreement, right? So, I mean, a border agreement is sort of how you process. It's very functional and very detailed. And the other thing is that was a bilateral agreement.
Yes.
So it was an attempt to do things that you could do on the Canada-U.S. border that you probably couldn't do on the U.S.-Mexican border. Can you reflect a little bit on how you think that went and whether that process is going anywhere in the future?
Sure. Well, one thing I think is going to be consistent in the Trump era with Obama's era is this idea that you can separate the borders. For the George Bush administration, what we often heard was there can't be a low point in the fence. And so that dragged us to, even on the Canada-US border, which was working well, almost having to be in lockstep. We couldn't liberalize any more than what we were able to do with Mexico. And I think it slowed us down. Obama was much more open to the idea of two strategies, two parallel processes. And I think Trump is as well. He's very focused, and not in a good way, on the challenges of the Mexican border. The challenges of legal migration and also drug smuggling. He wants to build a wall. He seems perfectly willing to let the northern border evolve in a different fashion. So I think we carry that forward. Beyond the border also had, I think, another useful dimension, which was the ability to do pilot projects and test things out that were specific to a local geography or circumstance, but might not be one size fits all for everywhere on the border. That flexibility was entirely lacking in the post 9/11 era, where we had to have everything be standardized and move much more in lockstep. And I think we had some great experiments. Some worked, some didn't pan out or proved too costly. And I think the experimentation gave us some insights. Where I would fault Beyond the Border a little bit is I think that we didn't take enough of the lessons and then expand the border wide. And in cases where we could have put a few more resources in to see if the project worked at a bigger scale, the money was never there. Now it's Congress, there are a lot of people to blame for that. But I think in that sense, we can take beyond the border, beyond just to the next level with better funding and better learning from the pilot projects and sort of taking best practice and sharing it everywhere across the border that it can be applied.
Right, right. And another point on this, the whole question of having, so President Trump is willing to see the Canadian border as one thing and the Mexican border as another. Now, there's one possible outcome of this whole process, which is that NAFTA disappears. We go back to a perhaps renegotiated Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, and then you get a new bilateral agreement with Mexico. Do you think that's likely, or is that a very, because when I look at NAFTA, when I look at the text, I kind of say, how are you going to make different rules from Mexico versus the United States?
So I think
versus Canada.
It is possible. So I think you could end up with a core NAFTA renegotiated, but perhaps scaled back, and then have with it a bilateral with Canada that does some things that you just don't feel comfortable doing with Mexico, and a bilateral between the U.S. and Mexico that does some things differently. And then I think the interesting challenge will be whether Mexico and Canada can then build a bilateral agreement that covers some of the things they're most interested in. Trump seems to be, what would you call it, open to all options, including both options at the same time. And so we can see a fragmented NAFTA. And I think in some ways the negotiation is heading us in a direction that we were in the World Trade Organization, or before that the GATT,
right,
where we had this proliferation of almost a spaghetti bowl of rules, and it was really hard without a good lawyer to figure out what applied.
Right.
And then we eventually got to a point where you had to do a cleanup round to make it all make sense again and simplify the rules. I think we're heading into complexity, not simplification, and it'll be up to a future set of leaders in the three countries to say, now we have this crazy patchwork in North America, how do we clean this up and make it work better?
Right, right. I know there's people in the audience that want to ask. And Nancy, I think you had your hand up, and then I'll get to, I've seen 3 or 4 other people, so.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I do have a couple of questions. I understand that there's a 6-month notification that has to be triggered before we go into negotiations. That hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't happened yet. Part of the reason that it hasn't happened is that we don't have a U.S. Trade Representative confirmed, and there's a bit of a tug of war. The Commerce Department, with Wilbur Ross, who has been confirmed, has been taking the lead on NAFTA renegotiation, but it's ultimately up to the U.S. Trade Representative to do the negotiation. The Trump administration tried the idea of having Commerce manage the negotiation, but Commerce is only accountable to Trump. Whereas USTR is one of these funny offices where it's in the executive office of the president, but USTR reports to Congress and is obligated to keep them apprised of what's going on. I tried to allude to it in my remarks, but one of the things that's happened is that Trump is reviving Congress's role in trade negotiations. And so he's resisted Ross's desire to manage this out of the executive branch and really wants a U.S. Trade Representative to take the lead to reassure Congress that he's sticking to the rules. And if that's his approach, we need to wait till Lighthizer gets confirmed. And right now, we don't have a confirmation vote in the offing. They're going to go on recess shortly, and they'll be back, I think, the 16th of May. And so we'll see if we can get one done before June and the summer recess.
So when Wilbur Ross is talking about November, December start,
He's being optimistic. I think he was also thinking he might have more control over the process. There's another dilemma, and I think it was exemplified in that kerfuffle we had where it looked like Trump was going to sign an executive order withdrawing from NAFTA. And that is that the administration has been remarkably slow to bring in confirmed people for very many jobs. I mean, they've got the cabinet in place, but there are a lot of empty chairs. And so you have a couple of guys in the White House who are more political than they are subject matter experts. They don't know anything about Canada or Mexico, and they said, you know, he promised he was going to get rid of NAFTA. Darn it, let's just do it. We'll just wish it away with an executive order. And they've been doing that with a lot of things. It was awful. It was just a stupid thing to do. It would have caused chaos and confusion. It was unnecessary. It was stopped thanks to a group of business people, Prime Minister of Canada, the President of Mexico, and they all descended on the White House and said, don't do this. It's really stupid. You're giving up one of your great negotiating chips for nothing. And what I think, as cooler heads prevail, we're likely to see, it's the U.S. year to host the North American Leaders Summit. Canada hosted in Ottawa last year. So I think what we'll see is the scheduling of a summit in which Peña Nieto and Trump and Trudeau are together, and it's a big photo op. And they say, we hereby cut the ribbon and start the NAFTA renegotiation, which they intend to kick down to staff and have them run it, because it will be a visual for I'm President Trump and I kept my promise. And that really is all I think he needs to do before the midterm elections in 2018. He probably has to have a deal before his reelection. And I didn't talk about that, but 2018 is a minefield with these two big elections. But 2019 is your next parliamentary election. And then 2020 is the president's reelection. So I think with all of that, we're probably not going to see an agreement until the early part of 2020 at best.
And my last question is about Wilbur Ross. I understood that he talked about the clauses with respect to environment and labor in the TPP and suggested that those could be transferred.
Yeah, so this has been a big discussion in the U.S. That the TPP, which at least at one point, all three of our governments administratively had agreed that TPP terms were acceptable. The TPP was overwhelmingly an American-style everything. Do everything the way we want and it's fine. So he wants to use that as a starting point, importing a lot of the changes and updates and modernizations, rather than renegotiating them, saying, if you thought that was okay with the Asian partners, can we just do it for the three of us in the hopes of expediting the negotiation? That may be optimistic. But for example, on dairy, this is one of the interesting things about the Canadian politics of all this. On dairy, Stephen Harper had negotiated a sort of deal with dairy farmers in Quebec mainly, that he would provide them with cash payments for the equivalent of the supply management benefits that they had in exchange for getting rid of supply management. So they would be, I don't want to say bought off, that's too kind, but they were going, or too cruel, they were going to get something. Trudeau has not made the same commitment, and I think the dairy farmers are very reluctant to let him proceed on a TPP path unless they get the same promise. Now that's a lot harder because the Trudeau government's running a bigger deficit. They're counting their pennies on some other things. So whether they follow through, I think that's going to happen before we can go back, for example, to the TPP situation on dairy.
Maureen Irish?
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the comments, as always, Chris. And I like being optimistic, but I have to say there are a couple of things that scare me a little bit. One is the border tax issue. Maybe we're going to see something or not. And even if it's not specifically a border tax adjustment as a tax on goods, I'm quite concerned about what might be coming forward from Speaker Ryan's proposal for this income tax related adjustment that would cover goods and services and intellectual property. I can see huge problems at the WTO and elsewhere. Should I just ignore that, or is this a big issue?
It's a big issue. I mean, so when we talk about trade, we're mostly talking about tariffs, and tariffs are just a tax applied at the border anyway. So it's the idea that you have a border adjustment tax is a sneaky way of bringing in a tariff of a kind. So there are a couple of thoughts on this that are floating around the DC that I mostly live in. As we like to say, the Washington that takes, not the Washington that gives. So that one of them is that Speaker Ryan has introduced the idea of a border adjustment tax, picking up to some extent on Peter Navarro, who's the Trade Council chairman and former Stanford Business School professor, with the idea that value-added taxes are a sneaky distortion of trade, because when the U.S. ships a good up here, they pay the value-added tax at sale, but when Canada sells the good in the U.S., there's only local sales taxes and the levels aren't equivalent, and so you need an adjustment tax to cover that gap. And so some people think that Speaker Ryan is really thinking that the U.S. needs a value-added tax, which would be politically tricky. New taxes always are, but it is the way that most countries have adapted, so they're not so reliant on the income tax. Ironically, Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto early in his administration, one of his big reforms was a value-added tax, because they had a very low rate of tax compliance. Multinationals paid, but a lot of the informal economy didn't. And they wanted to rebalance. And so the IMF and the World Bank said, you really need a value-added tax. And so he brought it in, and it wasn't popular because a lot of people suddenly were paying that didn't pay before. And now we're, of course, attacking him for doing it with a border adjustment tax. So it's sort of ironic to be poor Enrique Peña Nieto. So that may be what Speaker Ryan has in mind. Donald Trump, on the other hand, when he came out with his own tax reform proposal, doesn't mention border adjustment taxes at all. And what some people in his team, and Wilbur Ross had made this comment also, I think on, I want to say to Reuters, if we were to go with a border adjustment tax, maybe that could be part of the NAFTA agenda, i.e. that we go to the NAFTA table and say, okay, we're going to exempt North American trade from the border adjustment tax. It certainly would make auto companies and some of the energy companies very happy because they're worried about their competitiveness that they have to pay it. But then it's giving the U.S. a chip that we can use to extract concessions elsewhere. But I go back to my earlier comment. What makes me worried is that the uncertainty hanging over all this is going to dampen investment. It's going to slow down people from hiring new people. So the longer it goes on, the worse it is. I don't think there's a single position between Congress and the president on this. I think they're fighting over it, and you're right to be concerned. On the income tax and other side, I think that's the other thing that's going to have a big effect. If the U.S. moves the income tax rate or the corporate rate down to 15%, that will eliminate the advantage Canada has got from the Harper years of lowering the corporate tax rate to 15% here. Because we'd go to 15%, we wouldn't have a value-added tax, so the net impact would be quite good for companies. Also talking about lowering personal rates, and that would be quite favorable for American taxpayers. And they're talking about a one-time, I guess we don't say amnesty anymore because of immigration, but a one-time ability to repatriate profits and then moving to geographical taxation, so you tax things where they occur. The U.S. is a funny country in that we tax companies' profits and individuals' income, even if it's earned in France or Japan or anywhere else. And what that's done over the years is encourage businesses to keep their profits overseas so they don't have to pay the tax when they bring it back to the U.S. So they build branch plants, they build subsidiaries, they do all kinds of activity abroad, including moving some intellectual property abroad so that it stays in a more favorable tax environment. Trump wants to do that to bring money back and create more jobs in the U.S., but that'd have a big effect on the Canadian economy because there's a reason to keep money you make in Canada now. It might not be that good after a while. That'll put a lot of pressure on branches of American or multinational corporations in Canada, and it will encourage them to think about moving things back to the U.S. And you can't lower your taxes too much more than you have and still maintain, your current level of services. So I'm worried about that as well.
But is it the case, Chris, that in this whole tax reform there has to be some sort of tax innovation that's going to create some new revenue, given the reductions in the rates of the tax, the personal income tax and corporate income tax? I mean, there has to be something, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, right before the election, one of the things that the IMF came out with their debt to GDP figures, which are a little tougher than the way the U.S. government reports debt to GDP, because we tend to forgive ourselves certain liabilities and so on. And the IMF includes state debt, it includes all of that, and found that the U.S. debt to GDP ratio for the public sector as a whole was running at about 128%. And you'll remember that Canada was lambasted for having a debt to GDP ratio closer to 60% and called, the banana republic of the North by the Wall Street Journal and so forth. And this led to Chrétien making some big changes here. So we're not in a very good position at the moment. And to give up on revenue when we have this kind of debt to pay is not sound.
Right. But the U.S. has this tremendous debt. What's the term that's used? Debt tolerance, or basically the fact that U.S. bonds are always going to be the most secure.
True, and we have the reserve currency, and that's good. But the downside of that is, during the Obama years, we went with quantitative easing, which amounted to our Federal Reserve buying government debt because the interest rate was so low that nobody really wanted the debt. And so the Fed printed money to inject it into the economy and help keep the government going. Janet Yellen, with support from Donald Trump, has talked about raising interest rates to try to reinflate the economy as part of the growth strategy. If that's the direction we're moving, we're going to owe more for that borrowing. So, get you both ways.
Professor Andrew Richter.
Hi, Chris. I'd like to talk.
Oh, thanks.
I want to just maybe push you a little bit on one of the things you said, which was the defensive nature of Canada
Yeah.
on the renegotiation, and then pick up something Bill said about maybe where this is headed. Because I think we're going in defensive because we have a lot to be defensive about.
Fair.
And that's all these sectors which we've excluded from the previous from NAFTA: dairy, banking, telecom. I mean, we have sector after sector which is effectively closed, and we're going to want to maintain those exclusions in any new round. And that's why I come back to Bill's initial comment, which is I can see this going bad very quickly if the U.S. is intent on opening up these sectors, which Trump is talking. Certainly on dairy, he's been talking about it, and he hasn't. I don't think he's mentioned anything about banking and telecom, but those are also excluded sectors. So I just wanted your thoughts on that, and if in fact that remains Canada's intent to lop off these sectors, isn't it very conceivable that this thing could go bad very quickly?
So I think it'll be a rough ride because I think there is a lot at stake, and I agree with you that if you want to maintain some of the protected sectors that you have, you'll have to pay a price for it elsewhere. So you could maybe preserve banking at the cost of an unfavorable deal on softwood. So the politics of this are going to be managed by the Trudeau government at a high level, and it's going to be very tricky. I still think, though, with some creativity and a more offensive strategy, even asking for things you don't get, you can shift the negotiation a bit closer to a middle ground that Canada would be happy with, rather than just going in and saying, how do we not give up anything, which I think is going to make you a bit too vulnerable to bullying negotiating tactics. So one example, you probably saw the announcement a couple of weeks ago that there was an agreement on internal trade barriers inside Canada. And it wasn't a particularly impressive liberalization. I mean, the provinces were giving up some of them, but it was almost nothing. One option for the Trudeau government would be to negotiate the kind of liberalization with the U.S. that makes interprovincial trade barriers moot because, for example, mutual recognition of functionally equivalent standards and credentials would allow something to be good enough in the U.S. and therefore the province would reciprocally take it, even if they wouldn't do it province to province. In effect, we liberalize Canada by making it more open to a more liberalized U.S. I think the more creative we are about putting things on the table, the more we can focus on the hard stuff that we still need to achieve rather than the difficult things we don't want to reform. But I'll take us one step further. I don't think it's bad if Canada reforms telecoms and banking. Why is it that I pay a mint on roaming charges to take my cell phone up here? And it's the same in Mexico. It's one of the least successful sectors. The OECD, in their last report on the Canadian economy, they do one every 2 years, the 2016 report pointed out that there are a series of things, what they call network sectors, where certain protections for a limited number of players are allowed because they have to build up a network, whether it's cable TV providers or cell phone providers, airlines, or even banks because of the branch network, where the government protects them barriers to entry so that only a few people can dominate the market, so they can make enough excess profit, or I guess boost their profits, to pay for all that infrastructure. And then once they have it, they can milk it. And what's happened is we have relatively mature players in all these sectors. They're milking their infrastructure, but they're milking us in the process by relaxing some of those protections. Now that we have big players and they're not, babies or infant industries anymore, we could open them up. I think the net benefit for consumers and for people living in the three countries, let alone cross-border commerce, is huge. So I wouldn't mind so much if it's horrible for Canada to defend some of those protections.
Just a very quick follow-up. I mean, as my students would attest, I've been saying that in classes for 10 or 15 years, but it's so entrenched in Canada in these sectors, there is so much political opposition to opening them up that I'm very skeptical of it. And I agree, it doesn't work out well for Canadians, but these interests, dairy works to the benefit of 12,000 farmers and the detriment of 35 million consumers.
That's true.
That tells you how it works.
Michael Froman, who was President Obama's U.S. Trade Representative, tells the story of negotiating TPP, and with countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, who have a lot of established protection, one of the things that he would hear from his negotiating partners is, this is why the RCEP with China or other agreements with ASEAN and APEC haven't made the progress. Nobody but the U.S. demands total liberalization in all of these sectors and pushes us beyond our comfort zone. But only the U.S. is the kind of country we can go to the guy on the street or the entrenched family that owns huge sectors of our economy and say, we have to do it because it's the Americans. That's given, I think, U.S. trade negotiators almost a hubris, which is we can ask, we can set a high bar, we may not get everything, but we can push people outside their comfort zone because we're us. We have this huge consumer market and we can do it. Whether that's true, I don't know, but I think that's the same attitude that Trump is bringing to this negotiation. So it's going to be interesting to see how far the partners are willing to go.
Okay, I have Maurice and then Farhad here, and then if there's anybody online, maybe we get them next. Okay,
Sir.
After these.
I'm just wondering whether or not you expect to be a participant in the negotiations for NAFTA or whatever it turns out to be, an active participant. Do you expect that role?
Well, you know, so the DC trade community and think tank community is pretty small, and so in the sense that I guess Howard Cosell is a participant in the wild world of sports, I'll be making mouthy comments from the sides. What I found, especially in Washington, is if it's a catchy idea, they'll take it, run with it, and think they thought of it themselves. If it's a bad idea, they'll completely ignore you, and all your friends in the media will say, what were you thinking? That's the stupidest thing we ever heard. So only good ideas get stolen, only bad ideas stick back to me, so probably I won't have any great glory in this. On the other hand, one of the things that's been really interesting about Trump is the Trump era. First, you elected Justin Trudeau, who a lot of Americans started paying attention to again. I guess it was the negative charisma of Stephen Harper. You know, people weren't that excited about Canada. Maybe it's because they were excited there was another Justin from Canada who wasn't Bieber and they wanted to pay attention. Maybe it's his fabulous hair, but people were paying attention up here. And when the election went to Trump, there were a lot of people who were more progressive in the U.S. who said, you know, Canada, that's kind of more what I would like, and maybe I need an escape country. So they started paying more attention here, and then we elect Trump, and because he's threatened just about every sector of the Canadian economy, and every province feels the potential, and we haven't really talked about immigration, but there's another piece.
Get to that.
He's certainly gotten a lot of people paying attention, riveted, edge of your seat. What is he going to tweet next? What's he going to do next? So it's made it very interesting, and it's revealed that we have only like 5 or 6 people who follow Canada in any depth in Washington, and we're reaching out all over the country. We connect always with Bill and his team because you do some of the best border work in either country anywhere, and you just have to find that expertise to catch up. So I'll have an outsized role. I don't deserve it, but it will be unpaid, and I won't get any credit. Just blame.
Okay. Farhad?
Thank you. It was a very enlightening presentation. Before I ask my question, you touch base on the tourists between both countries, in Canada and the United States. Are you talking about individual tourists or group tours or what?
A little of all of them. My feeling about tourism is if you look just last summer, the Canadian dollar had gone down because oil prices, largely because oil prices had fallen. What that normally means is that over time, manufactured goods in Ontario are cheaper. You get a benefit from that, so they sell better in the U.S. But also the lower dollar attracts tourism. And we didn't see it like we'd seen it in past waves. And there are a couple of reasons, but one of them is you now require a passport. And if you look at tourism, say, between the United States and Paris versus tourism between the United States and Toronto, one of the big differences is the traveler. To Paris, you tend to get, couples celebrating their anniversary, or maybe they're dating, it's a honeymoon, you get business people and so on. The Canada-U.S. tourist trade has always included seniors, families with a lot of kids, and other sort of special populations where you throw a barrier like you have to have a passport into the mix, and it could be a deterrent. People say, well, yeah, we could drive up to Toronto, but we could probably go down to Cincinnati instead, or Florida and Disney, and it's a lot less paperwork, a lot less hassle. And although I think the governments have done a good job of trying to manage the regular crossers, the business people and others have gotten a lot of attention, I think the amateur crosser who doesn't do it often, it can get easily befuddled and deterred by the amount of extra paperwork and the threat that if you get it wrong, the penalties are there, right, and they just get scared off. Another area, a couple areas that are concerned, for seniors, you're taking medications, you're coming up for a period of time, you're in effect drug trafficking just for yourself. But because we had all that issue about people coming up for getting their prescriptions filled up here because of prices, that became an interest area for customs, and that scared some older people. Like, do I really want to go up there, and do I want to have this potential interrogation? Sometimes you see them on the bus tours, the customs guys are going through, and they suddenly say, well, are you taking any medications? Do you have any? And they're just pulling them out of the purse, trying to say, well, I have this and I have that. And it's needless harassment of people who are not a threat to anybody. A second area which has, I think, been hurt are young people. And I'm not talking about college kids, but school groups. Michael Chertoff, when he was Secretary of Homeland Security, created a waiver so that if you got the Social Security numbers of all the American kids, you could take them up across the border with their teachers as long as you took them right back, and you could file the list in advance for clearance. I don't think we go nearly far enough. You get a passport, and under 15, a U.S. passport's only good for 5 years because they want the photo to be updated. Fair enough, but it costs the same amount. And for your first interview, you got to bring the child, the minor, into an interview with an officer. For Nexus, you've got to see an officer on the U.S. and the Canadian side, which means only certain places are enrollment centers. And whereas Global Entry, for example, which Americans can apply for, you can apply for in lots of places around the country. We've made it hard to use Nexus even for folks. Then you have children of blended families or divorced parents, where you can't take the kid with just one parent across the border without raising all sorts of red flags. You don't want child trafficking, obviously, but why don't we have a way to have an inspector take a look at the court-ordered custody agreement and what's allowed and what's not allowed? Why don't we use a Nexus profile to put things like the other parent's cell phone number and other things to make the officer's life easier? So these people who are not a threat to us terrorism-wise can cross the border easily. Last area which I'm concerned about on the tourism side, we have sort of incompatible Puritanism in both countries. And the Puritanism in the U.S. is we're very tough on marijuana. And if you've had a marijuana possession conviction, if you even tell the officer that you've smoked marijuana because they ask you and you answer honestly, you can be ruled inadmissible into the United States. Similarly, if you have a drunk driving conviction or a substance abuse problem that is on your criminal record and you admit that here, you can be denied entry into Canada. And this is a problem for people going on ski vacations, but it's also a problem for truck drivers, bus drivers, other people moving back and forth across the border, where they've made a mistake, paid their debt to society, but now they're considered a risk because of the way our rules are. And I'm not saying we should give blanket forgiveness for mistakes, but I think that we should recognize these are not cause for non-admission. They should be in the misdemeanor category, not treated as if now we're going to bar you from crossing the border, which is so important to people's livelihoods.
So from what I understand, you're talking about individual tourists, not group tours.
Largely. I think group tours give you an ability to sort of organize a bit better, so they can, and you can have the tour operator provide a certain amount of support. But even there, we could simplify the procedures and make those things as easy as taking a group tour anywhere else, rather than making the border suddenly a factor that adds to cost and adds to the hassle factor.
Okay. A year and a half ago, I was in Hong Kong, and I read a statistic which is very important, or very interesting, anyhow. They expect by the year 2025 or 2030, I'm not sure about the year, 2025, they expect in that part of the world 1 billion travelers. 1 billion travelers. And they need 13,000 aircraft. 13,000 aircraft. Assume 20% of this amount came to Canada or the US or vice versa. What will happen to the customs, to the borders, I mean, with all bulletproof guns and all this aggressive questions, how much money you have, how long you're staying, whom you have, all these questions. Do you think anyone will come back again here?
No, and so I think
this is my question.
It's a very important question. Bill will know because we both done some work with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and they are a group out in the West Coast, includes Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, the Yukon, Northwest Territory, I know they're not provinces, and then Alaska. And they were very involved in planning for the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. And they came up with an idea, which they've been promoting ever since, of what they call the two-nation vacation. that if you're from China or Hong Kong or anywhere, that you could apply for a joint visa that would give you the ability to travel. If you go to Vancouver, you could also go down to San Francisco, or if you come to New York, you could go up and do Montreal, to simplify the process. Now, we know shortly after September 11, December of 2001, we set up this program called the Container Security Initiative. And under this Container Security Initiative, Canadian customs officers were in the Port of New York, New Jersey, Seattle, Tacoma, and Long Beach, as well as American customs officers being in Halifax, Montreal, and Vancouver. And what they would do is whoever was locally sovereign, the locals would do the opening and the inspection, but the other side could see, especially if the container was on its way into the other country. So that was a security measure. And by the time they'd done it together for a while, they realized, well, we know what each other are looking for. In Rotterdam, Hong Kong, Singapore, our Canada-U.S. customs officers will trust each other. Well, if you've looked at that container, it's fine, you know what I'm looking for. And they work together hand in glove, and it's possible for one person to, in effect, be deputized to do the inspection. We could do the same thing with Nexus interviews. We know what both countries want to know. You can have an American law enforcement officer, customs officer, ask the Canadian questions, share the biometric data that's required, and we don't need to have two officers there. On two-nation vacation, we could have the consulates and embassies of our countries abroad that are issuing travel visas just agree that they'll email the data back and forth. They'll share it. Obviously, it has to be secure so that applicant who gives permission for the two countries to look at the data, so we can do a synchronized visa so they occur for the same date so your vacation isn't ruined. I mean,
my understanding, they are sharing information in both countries.
well, we're sharing information on third country nationals.
Come back, they know each other.
All right, so now that comes up to an important thing. This is entry-exit, and this is one of the beyond-the-border achievements. We agreed first that we would share information on third country nationals crossing back and forth across the border, and eventually move to sharing entry-exit information for everybody who crosses the border. We're not at the point where we're sharing full entry-exit information across the border. And when it comes to visa applicants, sort of third country people that are coming in, the data is shared when they cross the border, but it's not necessarily coordinated that the visas are given at the same time. And this is stuff that's easy to do with computers now. So I take your point. There are going to be a lot of people coming to North America and are not having our act together and all the guns and tough talk, we're going to scare them off. So we've got to find a way to coordinate better. We have the technology. We can do this, as they used to say about Steve Austin and the $6 Million Man. So we ought to be able to do it. And so I agree. We've got to push in that direction very much.
I didn't know you were that old, Chris, actually. While we had an immigration topic here, in this particular region, we have probably the biggest concentration anywhere of people that actually commute across the border using TNs, at least between Canada and the United States. In fact, we have the Workforce Windsor Essex sitting right here who just did a report. I'll send you that report that looks at it, but it's 6,000 people, right? And the other day, I have a friend who's an immigration lawyer, and when that executive order, that the rumor of that executive order, she sent me a text and said, my phone just blew up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in this community that are very, very afraid whether they're going to be able to do that. Yeah. Should they be worried?
Well, all right, so here's my optimistic side, again, for Maureen as much as anything else. I think that that executive order was a sign of the weakness of the administration in bringing professional people in and letting his political people trying to make good on his campaign promises and doing so in such a sloppy way that they make everything worse. So the president said on the campaign trail that he was frustrated that he didn't think our immigration people understood where the threat from terrorism was coming from. There were too many incidents where we hadn't caught somebody, so he said, I'm going to put a ban on Muslim immigration until we can figure out what the hell's going on, right? So sounds that. Then he gets into office, and his executive order is a 90-day temporary hold on 7 countries initially. We go to 6 that were on President Obama's list of countries where the governments had collapsed or there wasn't good exchange of data, so we were really a bit blindsided. And the president goes out and his people go out and they trumpet it in the way that he campaigned on it and creates not only a backlash around the world to this, he creates judges who kicked out the executive order, not based on what it said, but based on his intent, which they derived from his media and his public statements, all of which exaggerated what he was doing. Yeah. I think that's just sloppy staff work. And until he gets real people who are professional staffers in to fill the administration, these political guys are going to be a problem for him. I feel the same way about the NAFTA withdrawal. There was no reason for that executive order. It was a stupid idea, but it was a bunch of people who were allowed to get almost to the point of issuing this thing. Ultimately, I think that there is a feeling in the U.S. and certainly among some of the Trump's voters that we don't have control of the situation in immigration broadly, and there are going to be future orders that are all about getting a handle on things. But the people who are here in Windsor, Essex, who are using TN visas are exactly not the problem. They're the people who've provided the information, who've played by the rules, and are working hard every day. They're not a threat. We know more about them. It's the people we don't know that should be worried.
Right. But I think also the fear is that if NAFTA were to go away, there's no basis for them to go to work the next morning, right? Yeah. So that's the fear. Again,
so the two are related, and I'd add one other thing. The president's...
Look at this, sorry.
Your phone is trying to tell you it's time to leave and go to this destination.
My maps... It's telling me where I am. It was telling me my address.
Telling you where to go.
What that's about.
Yeah. So the other thing that was interesting is there's been an executive order tightening up the rules on H-1B visas.
Right.
And this is an area which has been very controversial, but important for us here because Microsoft, among other companies, has a campus in Waterloo and they have a campus in Vancouver, BC. And why do they do that? Because they can bring in people without the H-1B quota applying.
Right. Yes.
And the president's tried to tighten that up, and this. To some extent, if the president tightens up H-1B visas, is a net positive for Canada because yours is a skills-based system. You're very welcoming to people who come and are willing to work hard, and so you've gotten the benefit of that. Right. And if he wants to be tough on H-1Bs, more people who graduate at the University of Michigan with great degrees in computer science are going to end up coming up here because they're not allowed to stay and work after we train them. So I think it's a very foolish policy, but it's another one of these policy that will have a knock-on effect on the Canadian economy.
Chris, I want to ask you one, it's a much broader question, but I just want to make sure we get it in before you go, because it's something I've wanted to ask you, and might as well do it in front of all these people. If the TPP had been ratified, which is unlikely, but if it had, it would have been a Democratic president, but it would have been done with the Republican votes. And the Republican Party and conservatives in general in the United States have always been the supporters of trade liberalization.
Right.
Has that as a sort of a main element of the canon of conservatism in the United States, has it gone away? Is it temporary? Will it come back? Or where do we stand there?
Well, that's a big question. I think it's still part of the canon. The problem for us in this last election was the politicians picked up on this faster than other people. It was an anti-establishment year. And there's been a feeling, I think, that on trade, we promised that opening would create growth, and it did. Liberalization generally has boosted incomes, created overall growth in GDP and all that, delivered everything we said. But we knew going in that the benefits would go to the most agile and adaptable factors, owners of capital, young, mobile, educated workers. But there would be costs that would disproportionately fall on the less mobile, people stuck with a mortgage, living with limited skills and so on. And right around the time of Canada-US free trade, both our countries created trade adjustment assistance programs that were pretty limited, and in the U.S. were very hard to qualify for. We gave out very little money. Part of the reason was that we were putting them in only at the behest of unions, so we designed them to be very complicated. So if you were in a union, your union lawyers could figure out how to get you the benefit if you lost your job, but almost no one else could figure them out or prove that their job was lost to trade. And I think as a result, we broke faith with a lot of people, particularly baby boomers who were in their 40s and 50s as NAFTA came in and who never felt that they got back to where in their minds they would have been if everything had stayed the same. So for them, globalization was a loss. And everybody knows somebody like that or some buddies like that, and they never forgave trade. This is what's behind Bob Dole saying, let's take a pause, see how these trade agreements work. And trade got a bad name. The NAFTA ratification in the U.S. was the closest thing I've ever seen in the U.S. to the Canadian parliamentary debate or debate in the 1988 election about Canada-US free trade. Everybody talked about it. It was very divisive. And after that debate, big businesses largely stopped talking about trade. They didn't advocate for free trade. They didn't want to have that argument with their customers or their shareholders. They just disappeared. And so trade agreements had to be done by basically a narrow compact among establishment figures who all knew it was good for us, even if we didn't like it or it wasn't popular in certain states. And that smacked a lot of people as just being darn arrogant. And I think it was manifested in the fact that we had a Republican and a Democratic nominee who both wanted to scrap the TPP, which we've never seen both candidates both want to get rid of trade agreements, and neither of them like NAFTA either. And during the election, a lot of people said, yeah, but Obama didn't like NAFTA, Chrétien didn't like NAFTA. Everybody came around and they kept it. So they knew in the end, once the election was over and they talked to all the crazy people out there, they could just do what they wanted to. And I think this was the election that proved you couldn't do it. Now, so here's my optimistic view. So I'm taking you to the depression now. I'm going to take you someplace hopeful. I feel we just have to rethink the way we distribute the gains from trade. I know it sounds redistributive, but why do we provide a cash benefit in trade adjustment assistance when we could instead provide a training benefit? It's what the Germans do, it's what other countries do when you have an economic adjustment. The U.S. now has nationalized student loan programs, and we have this wonderful educational system in both countries, actually, with not only the mainstream universities, but we have training institutes, technical colleges, online education, Trump University even, I think. So what if we provided something on the scale of the American GI Bill that said, you know, if you've lost your job, you have a certain budget for retraining. And we pay for it by having all employers kick in, which is what the Germans do, a certain amount for every employee, and it goes into a fund, and then Congress uses it to pay for people who are in transition and want to get another degree, or are in a job and want to upgrade their skills and move forward. This generation is different, the rising generation is different than our generation in that they're expecting to change jobs a couple of times. The idea of upgrading skills is more normal for them. And the government can help with that transition so that certainly the winners are going to win. They're going to move quickly and take advantage of a new trade agreement or new rules. But the people who suddenly need to adjust get some help adjusting. It's good for the whole economy. And I think we could start talking about that in a NAFTA context as well.
Right.
Not as a Republican or a Democratic idea, but just as an idea that reestablishes that the establishment isn't just better and holier than the rest of us, but is, and I say the rest of us, but you know, who am I kidding? I've been living in D.C. for 20 years. I'm part of the establishment too. But is more sensitive to the needs of the people in transition. And I'll go even one further. Now I'm going to get myself in big trouble. But trade is just one of the issues in which we've had problems with this. The other one that stands out is the environment. And I think there's a lot of thinking now that after this election, goodbye Paris Agreement, the U.S. is not on the climate change bandwagon anymore. It was a horrible elite conspiracy to ruin West Virginia. But I don't think that's actually what most Trump voters think. I think they felt that we were going to save the planet on their backs. So we went from a 50-cent light bulb to a $5 light bulb. Net good for the planet, but people's energy demand is inelastic in the short term, so they're suddenly paying $5 a light bulb, and that's expensive. We put on gas taxes designed to discourage fossil fuel use. The cars got more efficient, so if you were well enough off and you had a new car, you could kind of make it through. But if you were in the working poor, you need the car to get a job, or you're taking the bus, and the bus is now more expensive because it's compressed natural gas, and they have to charge the bus riders for all the upgrades, your life got more expensive. And I think we need to think less about subsidizing Solyndras and companies doing R&D and more about softening the transition costs for people who are least able to bear it. And that kind of thinking, I think, could reanimate the trust relationship between the people who run our countries and the people who vote for them or vote them out of office.
It's a great place to end because I think it's really a nice example of, Chris, why you're so respected in this whole field, which is that, you know, most of us, well, me in particular, I tend to do the analysis and say, you know what, we're screwed, you know. Whereas you always come up with something positive and some other solution, and I think that's one of the reasons that you contribute so much to these debates, not just on the border, but Canada.
Or proof that I'm out of touch.
Well, Canada-American relations in general. So thank you, Chris. Really appreciated this. I think this was really beneficial. I think everyone here today got a lot out of it. I hope people on Facebook enjoyed it as well.
Excellent.
And I want to say, you know, I want to acknowledge, you know, for example, Jennifer and Sammy and Pat and Maureen, who are CBI staff, who helped organize this, but also, you know, we think about nothing but the border. So you're kind of a rock star to these people. So, This is a great experience for them too. Yeah, that's right. We're not worthy. We're not worthy.
Oh dear.
So anyway, thanks a million, Chris. This was terrific, and we hope we do this every couple of years. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
That was really good.
That was fun.